If you were to tell me you can find a prime lens for Sony E-mount under $150 that supports autofocus and actually produces a good image, I'd have a hard time believing you. I've been doing a lot of Sony mirrorless camera reviews, especially in the NEX camera line, so Sony's older, kind of their first generation of mirrorless cameras. And I was wanting to look for a lens that would pair well with that system so I can recommend one to you, my audience. If you're able to find one of those NEX cameras or a Sony a6000 for an affordable price point, you obviously don't want to spend $2,000 on a lens because that kind of is counterintuitive if you're trying to save money on a camera body, but then you spend $2,000 on a lens. It doesn't really become a budget option anymore. So if you've been watching this channel, you know about the TT Artisan 27mm lens. I've included it in a couple camera reviews, but let's talk about this lens today. I think this lens deserves a dedicated review of itself. So here's the lens. As you can see, it's a super small lens, and frankly, the end cap is like a third of the overall size. So this is the actual lens size right here. Super tiny little guy. All right, let's start with the main highlights of this lens, starting with the price point at $149. It's very difficult to find another lens that has autofocus for Sony E-mount cameras that comes in under $150 US. So that fact alone, the fact that they figured out a way to make this lens that's actually really good for 149 bucks, man, props to TT Artisan for being able to provide us an affordable option for those who want to be able to have some variety in their selection as far as lenses and camera body options. The build quality is actually really nice. It's an all metal construction and it just feels really good in the hand. It's also very lightweight, so when you put it on your camera body, whether it's a bigger camera like the Sony FX3 with a top handle, or if it's a smaller camera like the Sony NEX3N, for example, it's not really gonna make any camera seem that much heavier because this thing is super small. There's actually also a cool feature inside of this end cap where you can actually attach a USB-C cable to it and then attach that to the lens and then do firmware updates. So there's gonna be future firmware update support for the TT Artisan 27mm lens with autofocus. Hopefully that will come with some improvements with these like newer Sony camera bodies that come out that have AI support and all these new features. It's nice that they thought about how they could update the firmware with the included end cap. Okay, let's talk about image quality. Image quality is actually really good. I've been producing a lot of my recent YouTube and social media content with this lens, and really no one has noticed. They've all just thought that my stuff looks really good and the photos look good, the video look good, and what they don't know is I used a $149 lens for a lot of this stuff. And you probably would think that I was just using my standard Sony 35mm or my Sony 50, and those lenses are like $1,200, $1,500 for those lenses. This is like a tenth of the price. The autofocus is certainly not the fastest autofocus around, and there's quite a bit of focus breathing depending on the situation you're in. But the fact that this lens has autofocus at all is really what sells it for me, because if you have a Sony Alpha camera, of course there's so many different options of manual focus lenses that you could purchase for your camera. But if you have a Sony Alpha camera, that means you have a world-class leading autofocus system built into your body. So you want to grab a lens that actually has autofocus to be able to utilize that feature. I ran some tests in the studio as well, and this lens actually supports autofocus eye tracking with my Sony FX3, which I was actually pretty surprised about. As far as this lens being limited to APS-C crop sensors only, I actually don't mind this because, first of all, I have several crop sensor lenses. Second of all, there's a lot of really great Sony cameras that are APS-C. Everything from the a6000 line, the a6700, the ZV-E10, all of the NEX cameras I've reviewed on this channel, all of those cameras work with this guy natively. And then it also works with any of the full frame cameras. Just bump it into APS-C crop mode like I did in this video. I showed you some of the FX3 footage. That's just shot in APS-C crop mode. By making it a little bit smaller, they were able to keep that price point down to the $149 that it is. If they would have chosen to go for the full frame field of view for this lens, I'm sure that would have brought the price point up to $250 or $300, which you just have a lot of contenders in that price range for full frame lenses. But the $149 price point, I think, is a more reasonable price point for this lens and offers a better access point for many different creators, those that are on a budget, and also people who have a lot of money to spend on production equipment, but want to just try out different things. People from all walks of life, all different fields of production can use this kind of lens. There are a few improvements that I'd love to see out of this. First being this end cap. It really does not, as I was saying, it just doesn't stay on very well at all. When you put it on and you screw it on, you have to find like this one little spot that it sticks, but with just a subtle touch, it falls right off. The reason that's important is because I don't want to lose this. This is how I would update the firmware. So you might be thinking to yourself, oh, hey, well, I would just use like a different Sony end cap. Well, there's a few problems with that too. Whatever it is about this lens, like even these don't stay on well at all. This just wiggles around and falls right off. Like here's another Sony lens that there's just like tension, right? It takes a little bit of effort to be able to twist that close, but now this is not coming off in any way, shape, or form. You really got to twist it to come off, and then it comes off. This guy, I don't know what's wrong with it. It's not the biggest deal in the world, but it certainly is something they can improve upon for future revisions of this lens. Another thing I'd love for TT Artisan to think through is how the performance of like putting the lens on the camera actually is. One of the biggest issues I've had is every time I put the lens on a camera, I end up twisting this dial for the aperture. So as I put this lens on the camera, as I twist, because of where the aperture ring is, I'm twisting that aperture dial. And now I've just twisted the camera to be in f8. So it's just a little thing, and I don't love that. I wish that there'd be more certainty that as I'm swapping between lenses, throwing this lens on a different body, that I'm not changing the aperture value. Now I would be at a constant 8 aperture unless I twist it back to the automatic setting where I can change via the aperture dial on the camera. I've also noticed quite a bit of vignetting when I'm shooting on APS-C cameras like the Sony a6000 or the NEX F3, and I notice less vignetting when I'm shooting on a full frame sensor in crop mode, which I think is a very strange thing. I don't know why that's the case, but it's just something that I've noticed and I want you to be aware of. But overall, I've been very impressed with using the TT Artisan 27mm lens that has autofocus support. If you're someone who's new to photography or new to videography and you need a lens that has a lower aperture value, like a 2.8 aperture, but don't want to break the bank, I think this lens is a great option for many types of content creators who are looking to produce high quality images, high quality results for an affordable price point. Thank you guys so much for taking time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, feel free to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I have a ton more videos about Sony Alpha cameras on this channel, as well as all sorts of filmmaking tips and tricks. Feel free to follow along for more. You can watch another video right here on the screen. Thanks so much, guys. Much love.